So our purpose today, and what we want to look at first, is to look at the identification of potential high-risk audiences that can be present in any community. Identifying a high-risk audience is part of a community risk assessment, which is also known as a CRA. Today we are specifically concentrating in this presentation on those who are receiving home health care services or are in hospice care. There may be other high-risk audiences in your community, but we're focused on a very specific portion of that this morning in our presentation. When we look at those that are in this high-risk group, here is a scenario, an actual fire that did occur, that involves an individual that was in fact receiving home health care. And as you can see in the text on the screen, this involved a 79-year-old victim, and the hospice worker was in fact present at the time the fire occurred. So we had someone there to assist. But as you can see that when the fire department arrived, unfortunately things had deteriorated. It's interesting to look at this one. Well, even though the fire department was just a mere mile and a half away, by the time they arrived, the fire was already blowing out of the back of the house. And obviously the occupant of the house perished in the fire. But there again, that is representative of this high-risk audience that we're talking about today, folks that are receiving that home health care, hospice care with that. So let's look at this community risk assessment. And where we go is to NFPA 1730, which is the standard on organization and development of fire inspection, code enforcement, plan review, investigation, and public education operations. When we look at 1730, we see that community risk assessment is the first step for reducing a community's fire risk. And NFPA 1730, and for some folks who are not familiar with that document, one way to think of 1730 is it's the fire marshal's version or complement to 1710 and 1720, the operations standard. So what is a CRA? Well, if we really get down to the bottom line, it's analyzing the data that's available and identifying the risks that are facing a community. NFPA 1730 makes it crystal clear that every fire department needs to conduct a risk and look at that, we moved back one, to look at those risks and identify strategies in ultimately developing what's known as a community risk reduction plan. But in order to get the plan, we need the assessment to begin with. I think everyone probably that is with us this morning knows that fire is a leading cause of injury and death in the United States, unintentional injury and death, particularly when we look at older adults. When we start to break this down for the adult population, we find that older adults are 3 times more likely to die in fire than younger adults. They are more than twice as likely to die in a fire than children ages 1 through 4. And as our population ages, the death rate goes up. By age 85, older adults have a death rate 4 times the overall U.S. death rate from fires. Clearly, older adults represent a significant risk in any community that we need to identify and develop a plan to help mitigate that risk. Part of that adult population are those that are receiving home health care. Now these may be folks that we could keep this as simple as individuals that just have someone come by and check on them, maybe the Meals on Wheels folks, on up to people that are in hospice care towards the end of their life. This population, this segment of the population is growing by leaps and bounds. Typically those folks that are in this situation with home health care, hospice care, are frail. What we are facing is the baby boomers are moving into this segment. The first portion of the quote baby boomers hit age 65 in 2012, which represents about 13% of our current population is 65% and older. And as you can see on the right hand side of your screen, the projections are that that percentage of our overall population that will be 65 or older will do nothing but increase in the incoming years. Again, representing a high-risk population that we need to address and help mitigate the problems associated with that. Now there's a number of factors that are working with this to create this high-risk population. Quite a number of folks that fall within that category are living alone. They have physical and or mental disabilities. Age brings with it reduced sensory abilities. Statistically, we also know that in the older population, alcohol use or abuse does seem to increase. Medications that they are taking to maintain life may often make them less responsive, may make them drowsy. And unfortunately, in a number of those, adding to all of the other factors with that, the housing that they have may be substandard because they no longer have the financial resources to maintain that property. So we've got a number of factors that are working that increase the risk for our older adult population. So if we take this and go from looking at the characteristics of the individuals to looking at the physical facilities, when we look at it from a code perspective, and particularly when we look at it in the 1 and 2 family dwelling aspect, those type of residential properties are the least regulated when it comes to fire and life safety. As unfortunately, in some jurisdictions, they have actually limited the ability of the fire service to have involvement in the design, construction, and inspection of 1 and 2 family dwellings. So if we look at the fire protection that's present, fire and life safety protection, maybe in the bigger term, essentially we're limited to smoke alarms. Now this is not to degrade the importance of smoke alarms. They are an important aspect of fire and life safety in a residential property. It is unfortunately rare to have residential sprinklers. Of course, the vast majority of our housing stock is existing, which increases the percentage of those that would not have residential sprinklers. One of the other code issues involved with it here is that in that residential 1 and 2 family environment, our egress is limited. As a matter of fact, for the code geeks that are listening to us this morning, you realize that in 1 and 2 family dwellings we really even don't talk about egress, we talk about means of escape. And part of that could actually be windows. Obviously, someone in the older population segment that has limited physical capability would really not be able to take advantage of that secondary means of escape. Typically, we have very limited or no what we would call passive fire protection. Passive passive fire protection being fire-rated assemblies, self-closing doors, smoke barriers, things of that nature. Compartmentation to slow down the spread of the fire typically doesn't exist in that 1 and 2 family dwelling environment. And then again, kind of combining the environment with the occupants, and particularly the population that we're discussing this morning that are in that home health care or hospice care. Typically there's no trained staff there 24/7, and individuals that may be there with them, i.e. a spouse, may also be in the older population. So we have someone who is significantly impaired being looked after by someone who has limited capability to assist in the event of an emergency. Really lining up a lot of factors that increase the risk for this population. One of those critical assumptions in this residential population is that the occupants are generally capable of self-preservation. This is how residential properties and the code requirements have been generated. There is that assumption that people are generally capable of self-preservation. Self-preservation means that they have the ability to evacuate without the direct intervention of another. They can take care of themselves, and that is difficult to do when we have an individual in that home health care or hospice environment. When we start to look further into this evacuation capability, so again, remembering that in the 1 and 2 family dwelling environment, everybody is assumed essentially to be capable of self-preservation, which means when we start to look at how evacuation is categorized in a facility that is designed to provide extra protection for these kind of folks, they define evacuation in the terms or concept of prompt, slow, or impractical. Again, in the 1 and 2 family dwelling environment, that capable of self-preservation is also essentially saying that everybody has a prompt evacuation capability. So if we look at, just for a reference point, how these evacuation capabilities are defined. Now these concepts, these times, these definitions are taken from NFPA 101, also known as the Life Safety Code. And they are typically applied to facilities such as residential board and care, which is how the Life Safety Code refers to them, although in some jurisdictions they refer to them as assisted living facilities. And they place the evacuation capability into those 3 categories, again, of prompt, slow, or impractical. And in the appendix of NFPA 101, they've actually put a time frame with these definitions. Some of the code folks that may be with us this morning that have been in the field for a number of years may remember that these evacuation times at one time were actually up into the text of the document, but in later years have been moved to the appendix. But they are still a good reference point. So if we look at prompt, and that's the ability of the group, although we could limit this down to say the individual, to move reliability to a point of safety in a timely manner that's equivalent to the capacity of a household in the general population. Again, remembering that that assumption in 1 and 2 family dwellings is folks can promptly evacuate. They are capable of self-preservation. We step on the ladder 1 point down to what would be considered slow evacuation capability. And this is where the ability to move reliable to a point of safety in a timely manner, but not as rapidly as members of the household of the general population. So in prompt, we expect someone to be able to evacuate within 3 minutes or less. When we go to slow, we are over 3 minutes, but not in excess of 13 minutes. And then we reach impractical, and that's the inability to reliably move from one point to a point of safety in a timely manner. That, when we put the time frames to it, is more than 13 minutes. Now these times are going to become real critical here in a few moments when we start to look at some fire dynamics and time frames. So again, thinking that prompt means I can evacuate myself within 3 minutes or less. If I'm slow, I'm over 3, but not in excess of 13. And if it's impractical, then I'm over the 13 minutes. So as we compare the level of fire and life safety protection in a what we refer to as a licensed healthcare facility. This could be a nursing home or a residential board and care, compared to what we've referred to here as the hospice home care, what we would see in a 1 and 2 family dwelling. So if we look at several of these issues, trained 24-hour staff, obviously in a licensed healthcare facility that exists. We go to the 1 and 2 family dwelling environment, no. And maybe, as I referenced earlier, maybe only a family member that has limited capability. Smoke barriers, that passive fire protection concept, they exist in licensed healthcare facilities. They don't exist in the 1 and 2 family dwelling environment. Fire suppression, specifically the sprinklers, we have that in healthcare facilities. Very rarely do we find that in the 1 and 2 family dwelling environment. Automatic fire alarm and detection. In the healthcare facility, we're at the top. Here we have not only automatic detection, but we also have automatic notification of the fire department. Typically in the 1 and 2 family dwelling, we have smoke alarms, which only provide notification of the occupants, no off-site notification of the fire department, which goes to the next line there, where we also tie in the local fire alarms. Those, in addition to the automatic fire alarm system in a healthcare facility, they typically have smoke alarms within each individual patient room, and that is typically the single fire protection feature in the 1 and 2 family dwelling. Control of ignition sources. In the healthcare environment, those are stringently controlled. We come to the home healthcare environment, no. Whether that be smoking, candles, condition of other ignition sources such as the electrical system, appliances, etc. The control of that in the 1 and 2 family dwelling, as everybody knows, is very limited. And the last factor that we wanted to look at in comparison was that of interior finishes. With the fire dynamics, the fire behavior, we know that the interior finish, what's present on the walls and the ceilings, can be a major contributing factor to the behavior of the fire. In the licensed healthcare facility, those are typically limited to Class A and B, the better in materials. And we go to the 1 and 2 family dwelling environment. Again, this home healthcare, hospice care environment, and it's Class C. And if we have some older 1 and 2 family dwellings, they may be presented with the fact that some of the old wood paneling that was done in the 60s and the 70s that doesn't even achieve a Class C rating. So we've looked at the characteristics of the people and why they increase the risk. We've compared the physical environment, that being the healthcare facility versus the 1 and 2 family dwelling. But our analysis of our community risk and the development of a reduction plan has to also consider fire department response time. And it's important to consider this in the concept of total fire department response time, which, if we go back to NFPA documents and we look at 1710, which is the standard on career departments, that is the time interval from the receipt of the alarm at the primary PSAP to when the first emergency response unit is actually initiating action or intervening some way to control the incident. Those are broken down into several segments, again making reference to NFPA 1710. So the first thing is the alarm handling time, and that is when they answer the phone. And this is answering the phone, transferring it, and handling it all over. 1710 puts a maximum of 105 seconds on the books for that activity. Then we get turnout time, and that's for the department to actually come in service. So we've got another 80 seconds on the table for the turnout time. Our travel time, 240 seconds or less for the arrival of the first arriving engine company at a fire suppression incident. We also then start to look at how much has now accumulated between the alarm handling, the turnout time, and the actual travel time. And what a lot of folks do not realize is that on a good day with everything working correctly, we could be 7 minutes past that call being received, initially that 911 call. What's not included in this time frame that's critical to our risk analysis is the fact that we have occupants that must detect the fire and respond to the cue, whether that is seeing it, smelling it, hearing a smoke alarm, whatever the cue might be, and then notifying the fire department, which can easily add another 10 minutes to the total time. What's always been interesting when I've looked at these is that in teaching a number of classes over the years with fire prevention folks, and actually even with fire investigators, we set forth this scenario of having a fire in a building, having it promptly detected and reported, and having the students give now estimates for what's going to happen in each case. And it has always been interesting that no matter where these students come from, and we do in this scenario do assume that it's a career department or it's a volunteer department with people in the station and during the daytime when people are awake, that every time we throw this scenario out, we get 10, 12, 13, 14 minutes for the first fire unit to actually arrive on the scene. If we had an area where we have volunteer service and there is no personnel on duty in the station, then the reality of it is the response time is going to become even greater. So looking at this, that even on the best day, we're up to in the 10-minute range, then we start to look at what's happening with the fire itself. When I start to look at the fire itself, we can see that we are up to that 3-minute mark on the report of the fire. Once that's reported, then we get the dispatch, the response time, and we can see that we are out there in the 9 or 10-minute time frame as we are setting up, and really before we have done anything to control the fire event. If we go back to those times in 1710, this chart and this time frame really starts to wake up your senses as to what this environment is that people are dealing with. As the chart clearly says, the smoke alarms present gives them early warning. but they need to be able to evacuate promptly, self-preservation, before the conditions within that 1 and 2 family dwelling deteriorate and the situation no longer becomes tenable. For all of the positive effects of a smoke alarm is not doing anything to control the event. It's doing nothing to suppress that fire. So we need to look at alternatives. What can we do to help mitigate that risk at that point when we have this high-risk audience present who cannot promptly self-evacuate, which is contrary to that primary assumption that's made in the typical design and construction of a single-family dwelling. So your fire department is in a very unique position to help. First off, you probably already have routine contact with these high-risk individuals. If your department is providing EMS services or providing support to EMS, it may be simply as lift ascents calls, but you know they are there. So we've got some automatic or insight into the presence of these folks. The other side is that this age population typically sees the fire service as a known, trusted organization, source of information. So we should build off of that they trust our particular profession. We've asked you to consider your community risk assessment, but also want you to realize this, that the reality of it is that you or your department is probably already aware of the risk of this high-risk population in your jurisdiction. Whether that be through the EMS calls that I mentioned just a moment ago, or the lift ascents calls, which may actually come from the resident themselves when Granny falls out of bed and they can't get her back. In some cases, the family members, when they have someone at home that is in this home health care or hospice environment, may actually notify the fire department about that. So your department is, in some respects, already aware of the risk. The really question is, what are you doing to reduce that risk? When we go back to that family notifying the fire department, Rick Merck, who's also here with us at Plumis, likes to add into that when he was the fire chief, they used to get phone calls about that, and the only thing they could do was put it on the books that Granny's at this residence, but they weren't doing anything to help mitigate that risk. All they knew was she was present there. So we need to go beyond just knowing. We need to go into that mode of reducing that risk. We are not in this alone. One of the other things that NFPA 1730 points out in doing the community risk assessment and risk reduction plan is to identify and seek out stakeholders. A stakeholder would be anybody that also has an interest in this population. They could be assisting you with identifying who these people are and also developing ways to reduce the risk. So, just think about that in the bigger picture of the hospice organizations that are already in place, the various home health care providers. There's quite a number of those out there now. Your EMS folks, whether that is internal to your department or a third-party source, even the folks like Meals on Wheels, to get their input in there to help identify where these folks are and ultimately reduce the risk. So at this point, if we have talked about the characteristics of this audience, their physical or mental capabilities, we have reviewed the physical environment in which they may exist in that home health care environment, and started to look at partnerships, all of which to identify where these risks are present. So we have the assessment, then we have the reduction plan. So when we start to look at the reduction plan, we start to think about or consider what other solutions could be present? What can we do to help reduce this risk? And this is where we get into our introduction into the Watermist technology. And we're introducing everyone this morning that's with us to the Automist technology that can be incorporated in your reduction plan. The Watermist technology is something that is not new. Through some of my reading and research, I ran across a report dated back in the 40s. I believe it was the National Board of Fire Underwriters that was entitled Fire Extinguishment Using Finely Divided Water. Unfortunately, even though that research was there, it never really, I guess, could say caught on. But in the recent years, we've kind of rediscovered that idea, and more research and engineering has gone into it. And particularly what we're want to introduce you to this morning is one of the systems made by Automist that's called the Personal Protective System or Protection System, or what we abbreviate as the PPS. This system was developed in the UK, but is now available here in the US. So if we look at this technology here from a little bit as an introduction, the Automist PPS is a very interesting setup. It is completely portable. It is completely self-contained. It's easy to install, as we'll see in a little video clip here in a moment. It includes a flame detector, a water supply, and a pump, all in this easy to set up package. Runs off of a standard 110 volt receptacle. Also includes an internal battery backup. And also, a very important concept of this is that it includes a cell phone connection, which can be programmed to provide text and voice notification anytime the system is activated or in the event of a power failure. And the fire department has the options of what kind of text or voice messages it want to send. So as we'll see, what we have now here is a system that is going to be suppressing the fire event and at the same time providing automatic notification of the fire department. One of the issues that came up in the development of the PPS was the concern about being able to protect an individual that is intimate with the fire ignition. And Mr. Andy Fox, who is head of the fire safety at Dorset Fire and Rescue Services, as you can see the quote that came from him, that he was happy to see this product being used, and the only solution to deal with people where the clothing fire is involved. And quite often with this population, we have smoking fires, etc., because they're incapable of self-preservation. They ignite their clothing. Detecting that is one thing, but we need to control that before it becomes a direct, serious threat to their life. And that's the reason that we use the flame detector. So we have here a little test where the clothing on an individual is being ignited. The flame detector has picked that up, and what is going to occur when that picks that up is the first thing that occurs is an audible message that essentially says, put out the fire, put out the flame, and if you don't, it starts a countdown, and the system will discharge in, and then the system fires and controls the event. This has also been tested in a wide variety of configurations, not just clothing fires, but furniture fires, including ones which the fire itself was somewhat shielded. As you can see from the graph that's being generated on the right-hand side of your screen, the red line is the one without any protection in the free burn mode. The green line represents the conditions with the PPS in operation, and that is even with a significantly shielded fire. So you can see that it's effective even in that event, even if it's shielded. As I said a moment ago, one of the beauties of the PPS system is its portability and its ease in setup. And here we see a couple of guys from the York, Pennsylvania Fire Rescue setting one of those up. As you can see, they were carrying the system in a number of pieces, the water tank, the pump unit. So it is completely self-contained. It has a 16-gallon tank, which at the flow rate of approximately 1.6 gallons a minute means we have a 10-minute water supply. It's attaching to the building's normal 110-volt electrical receptacles. Activated by flame, smoke, or heat detector, again, because of the desire to be able to protect an individual when it's their clothing being first ignited, when they're intimate with the ignition, the preferred method is a flame detector, although it could be set up with smoke or heat. Completely self-contained, again, on that power supply. Not only is it primarily connected to the building's electrical service, should the power fail for any reason, it will operate on the built-in battery, the UP system that's built into it. And I'm not only suppressing or controlling the fire, I am providing automatic notification of the fire department to get those services in place and responding to the event to take care of the person once they arrive. So this is a complete package, as you can see. One of the things about this is that it is completely reusable. So if you have identified someone in this high-risk audience, say maybe they're in hospice care, you find out about it, you put the system in, the person ultimately passes away, you can get the system back and moves on to the next situation that you need to take care of. So it's completely portable and that completely reusable, which is a great aspect of this technology. And this is just only one of the systems that Automist has, but it particularly deals with this high-risk home health care hospice type of environment. There's been a number of situations where we've done a lot of testing with the Automist. About 2 years ago now, we did some testing down at the Maryland Fire Rescue Institute, and one of the individuals that was present there was a gentleman with Liberty Mutual Insurance. And as you can see, he points out that at the conclusion of the test, there was virtually no damage to the room or the contents. Sonny Scarf, who was the fire marshal internally for Marriott for quite a number of years, also pointed out that this is a system that performs exceptionally well and does much less water damage. And the protection that we have available, like I said, is available in a number of different systems, but our concentration this morning was on the PPS. So if there is, other questions that you might have or a desire to see some of the other technology and the other type of cigarette configurations that we do have available, just visit our website and you can see those. You can also see a number of videos of the testing that has been done in a variety of situations. So if you just visit www.plumis.com and in the upper right-hand corner of the home page, make sure you click on the US version so that you get the information here for the United States. And that will give you even more information about PPS and the other systems if you have a desire to look at that, or also will provide for you all of our contact information if you have questions now or in the future and want to look at this. One of the things that you might want to consider is if you've done your community risk assessment and you start to develop your reduction plan and you believe that this kind of technology may work within that realm that you have identified in your community, obviously doing the assessment and the plan is providing you with significant data justification for, say, applying for a fire grant to be able to defray the costs of these systems to help protect your community. So that may be something else that you might want to think about. We'd be glad to assist you with that. Again, visit the website. You can get our contact information. We will ask you here at the end of the seminar, you will be linked to complete a survey on the information that we have presented. Once you have completed the survey, then you will get your certificate. As you see, we are a ICC preferred education provider, which means that you will be getting CEU certificates for attending this morning on the seminar. If anyone's got any questions that would now you haven't already typed in, now would be a great time to do that while Yusef and myself are here, whether we can take a chance to or time to answer any questions that might have come to mind.